So I didn't prepare to talk about this young man's case. Shaken Not Stirred was going to give her poem about him, but his story definitely deserves to be told. So I was assigned this child's case in juvenile court. In court, I was told to go talk to him. He was locked up in the back room. I was given a thick file, his history in the juvenile court, and so you can only be 15 in our juvenile courts, so Lord only knows when that case started. I go back to see this young man, and he's tiny, and he's in shackles, his arms and his legs. And he's beautiful. He's got these big, giant curls, his beautiful brown skin, his big, scared eyes. And I quickly learned that he's brilliant. He is so intelligent. The state is trying to lock him up until his 18th birthday for some relatively minor felonies. If he had been 16, he would have gotten probation for these felonies. But because of how our state is incredibly messed up with our youth, our juveniles, he gets a possible 3-year sentence for these small, nonviolent crimes. It was at that point that we decided, he and I, that we were going to fight the state in imposing this sentence. We were going to fight like hell. And so we decided to hire a mitigation specialist, and we hired Tessa to come on the case. And we had about 3 weeks to get the case together. And I'll let Tessa tell you about what we found.
So I'll just say that Beth, or Elizabeth, if I have to call her that, is a dear friend of mine from law school. And when she first asked me to work on this case, I thought she was joking, and I probably said something smart, because in the criminal justice system, usually juveniles don't get a mitigation specialist. Usually you do mitigation to prevent jurors from imposing the death penalty. Usually juvenile stories aren't told. But this case was just so messed up. This child's court counselor, who was really supposed to be helping him get his life together and working with his family, actually didn't know the case and lied about some important details because he just wasn't sure what to say. I think he lied about this kid's prior record, and that was in open court, on the record, lied about this kid's case. And so we decided that we had to tell his story. And I'll just say that in my time as a mitigation specialist, I, of course, came across some of the horrific stories that you hear that people like Elizabeth and Vicky and Ken come across every day of abuse that just, really, as I think Elizabeth Hamburger mentioned, doesn't even really capture what happens to these children. And I was in the back as Elizabeth Hopkins Thomas and I were talking, and I was trying to think of some of the worst examples of abuse in my capital cases. And, I came up with a few. I could go on and on about those stories, and I won't tell them, but this kid's story, this abuse was, I think, definitely on par with some of the defendants in my capital cases. The things that he had experienced, he had been stripped naked and beaten by a stepfather when he was maybe 3 or so years old. He described being fought the way that dogs are fought, and mind you, that's illegal for animals, but was fought against a step-sibling in order to, his mom promised him, go to Disneyland. And I think we found also in records that when he was, I think it was 2, he had fleas because he was so neglected. And so I told his story on the stand, and Mom was sitting right there, and I'll just make a note about Mom. In capital cases, you have the time to go into detail about generations of this person's story. Ideally, you do. So I knew from that work that I know that Mom had a story, and we started to unravel that one. And it was an important story, and that's a story that will never get told. But Mom, as she sat and listened to me tell this story, during the time that I said that, when this child was 2, he had fleas, she stood up and started to cuss me out while I was on the witness stand, saying, "Why are you saying these things? That boy wasn't even with me at the time, that boy." And the reason he wasn't with her at the time was because Mom had a drug addiction, and Grandma took over at that time. So that's why that boy wasn't with her at the time. And I'll have to say, I feel for her, definitely, who had to sit there and listen. The judge told her to be quiet, and I think she was held in contempt of court because she didn't show up at lots of other things for him. So we didn't get to tell her story, so I feel for her, and I feel, of course, for this kid who we came across, and I remember he was ultimately sent to YDC, a youth detention center, and we left, and I think Elizabeth is a little bit more stoic than I am, or has just been through the fire and hears stories like this every day. But me, with my experience working on capital cases, I went back to her office and I cried. Because when you're working on a capital case, you are looking at someone whose trauma, well, certainly it's current, but much of it is in the past, and they are adults, and you are looking at a juvenile case at someone who is in the fire. Right now, this person's life is the way that it would be if you were telling the story in a capital case years later when they become an adult. So I'll just say that to segue sort of into our next person is that's just one of the stories that I came across. And, again, I think like Sharif mentioned, those are some of the extremes, but there's all in the middle. But what these people have in common is that they're human beings just like you and I. These people, those criminals who've been smacked with this label of criminal, they deserve better than our current criminal justice system, and we have to do something about that. So with that, I'll welcome our Executive Director, Dawn Blagrove, and Carolina Justice Policy Center Board Member, Mandy Sellars. Thank you.